Think back to junior high. Were you labeled? Did friends or classmates call you something that kind of boxed you in? Were you called something like jock or nerd? Maybe you were called goody-two-shoes or party animal. When you were called that, did you resent it? Were you pretty sure they were taking the easy way out? And do you know anyone who does that today? Let's think about that together at Calvary. Welcome to At Calvary. This is the podcast home of Calvary Baptist Church, and I'm your host, Pastor John. On the At Calvary podcast, we talk honestly as Christians about Scripture, truth, life questions, and even current events. Sometimes what we talk about is deep. Sometimes it's not. And we hope to be plain-spoken, fun, and even sometimes thought-provoking. So sit back, put your thinking cap on, and enjoy these thoughts about God, the universe, and everything. Now today we're going to talk about how we talk to and how we talk about one another. And it's really going to touch on how we talk about the issues of our day. And so if talking about politics, even in terms of our attitude and our heart about it, bothers you, feel free to pass on this podcast. Because today we're going to talk about how people who disagree with people of faith like to put labels on those people of faith. And largely how they do it so they don't actually have to interact with their ideas. They can just call their ideas with a single word, bad. Now, at first, when I was thinking about this topic, I was only going to talk about one of these labels. That's the label of Christian nationalism. But as I kept thinking about this idea and thinking about how the label of Christian nationalism gets stuck on people and then nothing that they say and nothing that they believe has to be really interacted with, I suddenly thought about how these labels aren't used to describe what people believe. They're not descriptors. They're used instead to marginalize. And I want to talk about not just Christian nationalism, but other labels, and I want to kind of put them into three categories with subcategories underneath them. And those three labels, those three categories that people are kind of marked with and then shunted to the side in terms of, issues and modern political discourse are these labels. The labels of bigot, the label of backward, and then, of course, the label of radical. Bigot, backward, radical. And in the area of bigot, we're talking about the labels racist or homophobe or misogynist, those kind of labels, where we are basically, labeled a bigot, sometimes just general, and sometimes we're very specific. Or we're called backward, those labels like narrow-minded, simple-minded, or the modern one right now, weird. And basically it is a declaration that we are a throwback to an earlier era that is no longer relevant for today. And then, of course, there is the word radical. And, of course, under that category, we have the fascist, we have the totalitarian, and we have the Christian nationalist. Now, these words, bigot, backward, radical, they actually have a definition that is intended to describe where someone is coming from and what's motivating them. And what is that? Well, the word bigot, for example, and all the other subcategories of bigot. This is a descriptive word that is trying to describe a person whose views on particular subjects are largely influenced by fear or hatred of a particular group. So when we say that what someone says is racist, we're saying that what they're saying is being motivated by fear or hatred. And the question, the dialogue should be, is that true? Is it based on fear or hatred? Or is it based on something else? But if you're using it to describe, that's the conversation. If you're using it to label, you just slap it on there. And then that's just a given. A given is the things that this person is saying are racist or misogynistic or homophobic. What about the word or label backward? When someone is talking about that someone's ideas are backward, they're saying that a person, their views on whatever that subject is that you're talking about, that their views are largely influenced by a desire to go back to an idealized time that may or may not have actually existed, but they want to go back there. That's why we use the term backward. And people who have backward-facing ideas are influenced heavily by feelings of nostalgia for a real or imagined past that they believe is better. And again, if you say that someone's ideas are backward or narrow-minded or simple-minded, what you're talking about or what you're trying to describe and what you should be dialoguing about is, are these ideas just backward-facing? They're just wishing for a simpler time that actually can't exist today. But again, if we're using that to describe, that's the conversation. If we aren't, we're just slapping the label on, then we just, again, identify everything what a person says in that category as backward, and we don't have to actually interact with their ideas. And the same is true for radical. Now, I want to focus on the word that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and that is this term Christian nationalist. Because if you're describing a Christian nationalist, this is a person whose views on the government and its systems and its roles are largely influenced by the union of religious morality and a belief in the home country's exceptionalism, and then many times a deep respect for and a desire to return to a simpler understanding of the founding documents of that home country. Now, when it applies to Americans, and since that's who I'm probably talking to today, you can see how that connects. So a Christian nationalist would be an American. We're going to apply it to America now. And that person believes that the government and its systems and how the government plays into everybody's life, its roles, is a union of Christian morality, a belief in America's exceptionalism, that we are truly a great, if not the greatest nation on earth, and then a desire to return to a simpler understanding of our founding documents, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, that we should get, back to those documents. And the conversation in Christian nationalism is how much, and I'm not using this word in its ultimate sense, like with guns and knives and armies, but rather in the sense of how many laws should be passed and how strict should those laws be, and that is the use of force, the use of the administrative and the judicial arm of the government to bring about the changes that you think are correct. And this is where the term, the bumper sticker, radical, the label is sometimes popped on the Christian nationalist. Because instead of actually conversing about the ideas and having the push-pull conversation of, well, everyone has an idea of what the government should be doing in the lives of its citizens. And really the conversation on Christian nationalism is how much power do we give the government to, require its citizens to act a certain way and to be a certain way and to do things a certain way. And some individuals on the political spectrum are much more comfortable using the administrative and legal arms of the government to create change. And some of us are not. Some of us really want the government to kind of let go of much of its power. But that is an in-house conversation, and it's a push-pull conversation. It is a conversation we are having, but when the label is put on, the conversation about it stops. We stop talking about how much force a government should have to require its citizens to act a certain way and be a certain way. We stop having the conversation. That's how a label is put on there. You see, labeling is the adult version of this. You know, on the schoolyard back when we were kids, someone accuses you of something and you say, "I am not," and the other person says, "Oh, yes, you are." See, this is the adult version. In politics or in the sphere of ideas, it's where we basically accuse one another of being something, and that's where the conversation stays. The conversation stays in the area of the label. And, the other childhood way of saying it is, "I know you are, but what am I?" That kind of petty, I'm going to slap this label on you, and now I don't really have to deal with any of your ideas or what you're thinking or why you're thinking that. I don't have to analyze, hey, we can't use this much force to accomplish these goals. Instead, we have to be more of a, let's use the bully pulpit, let's use the structures of our communities to encourage this way of thinking and being, but we're not going to legislate it. We're not going, having that conversation is the healthy way to talk about our differences. But instead, we just label it and we don't have to talk about it. See, a description is supported by clear arguments. But when it is used as a label, it becomes an accusation. And the accusation alone is proof for those who are having the discussion. So that the other person, that person who we don't want to listen to, by definition now, they are what we have labeled them. So we don't have to interact with their ideas any longer. All we have to do is say, it is this, it is radical, it is backward, it is bigoted. And that is where the danger lies. Because instead of actually talking about issues and the merits thereof, we just label them that way. And I want to talk a little bit more in a moment about how Christians should deal with that, work through that. But right now, I just want us to think together about how that is challenging for us. Because it is. It is truly challenging for us to be labeled, and then suddenly there's this pressure on us to distance ourselves from the label because of how people are using it. And you and I need to really think about that. That sometimes it is good to distance ourselves from a label because we're being compared to someone very specific. If somebody calls you a bigot and then compares you to someone who is obviously racist, someone who won't hire a person of color because of the color of their skin, or someone who would be comfortable, running a person of color out of town, in the old expression, on a rail because of the color of their skin. And we would say, no, you're comparing me to someone who is horrible. That is wicked. No, I'm not that. And so if that's what you mean by that word racist or bigot, then it doesn't apply to me. Let's actually talk about the ideas. But there are other times when we're not being compared to someone specific. We're just being called the label. And you and I are going to have to ask and really wrestle with, and I'm speaking here first and foremost to Christians, about, is it possible that we need to be more comfortable being called certain things. Not with agreeing with people that we obviously don't agree with. I don't think we should do that. I think that is something that we need to say, no, I disagree with this person, here's why. But just because we're called a certain thing that isn't actually true, I'm thinking especially when we're talking about the things of God, the things of Christ, the things of truth in the Word of God, that might be, tangential to Jesus himself, but they are things Jesus said, or there are things that Jesus said through the Old Testament prophets. And we would have to say, I'm owning that. I'm owning that belief. I'm owning that perspective. And if that's the label you put on it, I'm okay with it. And here's why. There's a good example for why that is okay. Why we might need to come to peace with not everything we are called, but the terms that they just keep using over and over and over again. And that is because, and the example is the example of the disciples. Because probably today, 2,000 years later, none of us mind being called Christian. We don't. We don't mind it at all. But according to church history, that name was not a compliment when it was first used. For the word Christian is a diminutive. It's like when you call someone, puppy or baby or kitty, and I mean kid-y, not kitty like the cat. But when you call someone and you add the E on the end, and you're it's fine in family, it's kind of cute when it's a husband and wife or a boyfriend and girlfriend, but if somebody you didn't know called you shorty or tally, it would be offensive, at least mildly offensive. Like, who are you? Why are you calling me that? That makes no sense at all. That's not what we do. You don't know me. And that's what they did in Antioch with Christians. They called them little Christs, little Messiahs. And the early church decided that the proper response to being called little Jesus or little Christ, baby Jesus, that kind of thing, that the proper response was to embrace it rather than push it away. Now I realize these pejorative terms are worse, but it does bear on us to ask, are we going to have to wear some hard labels at times and just be at peace with it? Not just fully embrace it, that's not what I'm talking about, but to be at peace at times when people call you bad names, when they label you. Because we are not children. We are full-grown adults. And we know the truth and the lie. And I realize in this Twitter, Facebook, metaverse thing that we live in, we're all afraid to be labeled things because we think we'll be marginalized. But to be honest, the opinion of the masses is not actually real. Most of those are just hot takes and snap judgments, and the person doesn't actually believe half of what they wrote. And they're just being obnoxious because that's what the Twitterverse and the metaverse and the YouTube verse and the Snapchat verse and the Instagram verse, all of those little universes, they all encourage unchristian, snap, unfully thought out, mean responses. That's what they encourage. And I think that is something worth our contemplation, that the vast majority of those criticisms are meaningless. And the opinion of people online ebbs and flows like a river or the ocean. And so how do we come to peace with those things is a really good question for us. Because you may say, I can't come to peace with it. And I think that's a perfectly fine Christian response. However, just kind of knee-jerk reactioning, always fighting being called something, makes it difficult to move forward in your conversations with friends and family and those that are close to you. Because if they label you, and you are always fighting about the label and not about the actual content, then you never move, you never change. And your conversation never moves forward. And it needs to move forward. Spending time on fighting over what people call us is many times a waste of time. So think about that as you're thinking about this idea of how you handle being labeled and how these labels are used in our everyday conversations. So in a moment, we're going to think about what's a Christian to do when they're labeled by those around them. But let's pause now and think about a proverb from our friend Solomon. This is from Proverbs 16, reading verses 4 through 7. Let me take a drink. He says, "The Lord has made everything for its own purpose, even the wicked for the day of evil." I want to pause there. I'm going to read the rest of it in a moment. But this is kind of the gauntlet that Solomon throws out here as he's challenging us in thinking wisely about all the things that are happening in our lives. Because sometimes I know we say everything has a purpose, but the way we say it, I kind of think the next sentence is, but I have no idea what the purpose of this bad thing in my life is. But Solomon says everything is made for its own purpose, even the wicked for the day of evil. And he goes on and says, everyone who is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Assuredly, he will not be unpunished. By loving kindness and truth, iniquity is atoned for. And by the fear of the Lord, one keeps away from evil. When a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. So Solomon lays out the gauntlet. Everything has a purpose. He then begins to talk about things that have a purpose that sometimes we struggle with understanding their purpose or believing that their purpose is significant enough. What are those things? Well, does God have a purpose for the wicked in the world? Both the wicked people and wickedness. And Solomon's answer is yes. The reason that God has for wickedness is for those days of evil. What does he mean by that? Well, he means that there are times when God is going to show his judgment. And judgment is going to come upon a people, and it will become crystal clear that the foolishness of their leaders or the foolishness of their sin is why this judgment is coming. And everyone will realize, they will come to know, this path we were on is wrong. We need to change. And it will be crystal clear. Think about the man Jonah. When he goes into Nineveh, and he proclaims that in 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. Well, that wickedness, it just brought them up short. It was like pulling on the reins of the horse. All the way from the king on down, realized that the direction they were going was completely and utterly foolish. That death was coming for them. And the entire nation, from the king on down, begged God to give them another chance. They put on sackcloth and ashes. They repented of their evil deeds as they understood them. They were there for the day of evil, and it demonstrated the justice and how wonderful also the mercy of God. What about the proud? The proud repeatedly demonstrate how blind pride makes us. Think about how often people are caught in the public sphere, in their sin, doing things and then trying to cover up in such sloppy fashion the things that they did. Have you not seen that? You know, from kings on down to local officials, we see people do wicked things, compromising things, things that would get other people fired in other jobs. And then they try to cover it up in such sloppy fashion. Why is that? Because that's what pride does. Pride not only leads you to do things that are detestable, it also leads you to believe that everyone is dumber than you, and so you can cover it up easily by just kind of, throwing some whitewash on it, and it'll be just fine. You know, that thin paint that they used to use for picket fences, and you can just cover it up really poorly, really quickly, and no one will notice. And it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz, that wizard behind the curtain that Toto revealed. It's like, really? Did you think a curtain was going to keep you safe, that no one would ever catch you? And of course the answer was yes, because the wizard had gotten proud. And so it's this kind of thing that, the pride allows us to see the danger of pride. It has its own destruction built in. And on the flip side, being lovingly kind and truthful, sometimes that looks like very weak power indeed. It looks like there's no way, just by being kind and loving and being persistently truthful, that we will be able to get the life that we want. But yet, we make a lot of mistakes, not on purpose. And what does loving kindness and truth do? It shows people that the mistakes that we make on an everyday basis are not who we want to be. They're actually what we struggle against. And so people give us more benefit of the doubt. They give us benefit of the doubt. They forgive us because they see we're getting up the next day and we're trying to be loving, kind, and truthful again. We're going to show mercy and grace to others. We're going to live our lives truthfully before people. And they see that and they say, that person isn't always a booger. They, most of the time, are not a booger. Yesterday, they were kind of grumpy with me, but that's not who they want to be. And so we what? We atone for our sin through loving kindness and truth. So if you think loving kindness and truth is too weak a power, well, in everyday relationships, it is an amazing power. Because loving kindness and truth, being clung to tenaciously, demonstrate to others that our foibles and our mistakes and our failures are not who we are. They're who we're fighting against being. And so everything has a purpose, even the things that appear to be weak, and even the things that appear to be wicked. All of them have a purpose in God's plan. And that's challenging. But yet, Solomon declares it. It is the gauntlet he throws down and says, will we believe this? Will we live this way? Believing that God uses everything to accomplish his purposes. That's how big and great and good our God is. That's our proverb today from Solomon. But now, for the second half of our time today, what's a Christian to do when they're labeled or marginalized? I've already challenged you to consider whether some of those labels you and I might have to come to peace with. Not embrace like we own it and we put it on a t-shirt, although you might do that. But rather that we don't let it ruffle our feathers and always have to fight. Oh, you call me this, you put this label on my ideas, or you put this label on me, and now I have to defend my honor against it. That kind of thing. But I want to think about kind of a general rule of thumb with regards to being labeled or marginalized. And let me look here. I wrote down seven thoughts. And I'll try to go through these quickly. And some of them will be obvious. Like, number one, if you are labeled or marginalized, resist the temptation to do it back. Have actual dialogue. Invite a conversation. Don't just throw out accusations. They call you backward, and so you call them progressive. They call you simple-minded, and you call them stupid. Don't do that. Make a case. Invite feedback. Come to a conclusion. Dialogue. Don't just throw out accusations. Number two, and I've already touched on this, so I'm not going to hit this very hard. Decide some pre-conversation foundational principles. So in other words, which labels are you okay with owning? Some of you're going to be okay with owning being a Christian nationalist. You're going to be okay with owning being called backward or simple-minded or, leave it to beaver. You're going to be okay with that. And some of you aren't. So which labels are you okay with owning? And what type, again, these are pre-conversational foundational principles, what type of discourse glorifies Jesus? And what type of conversation doesn't? Some people will say that any weapon we can use against those we disagree with, any weapon is justified. However, I don't actually believe that we believe that. And the reason I don't believe that we believe that is because we are truly offended when someone uses some of those weapons back at us. This happens all the time in politics, where a Republican will accuse a Democrat of using a particular style of rhetoric, and then the Democrat or the Republican will use the same style of rhetoric back. And it's like, well, wait a second. Do you really not like it? Do you really hate it? Do you justify it when you use it? But oh my goodness, how dare they use it? That kind of thing. And it happens both ways. You might be saying, well, it sometimes happens more over here, and I'm not gonna. That's not what I'm talking about. It's not a how much, 90% on this side and 50% on that. No. But my point is, we sometimes pretend that any weapon is justified, but we don't actually believe that. We believe there should be limits. And that's the question I want you to ask. What type of discourse glorifies Jesus? Is it just the discourse where you win? Or is there more to it than that? And then, with regard to pre-conversation foundational principles, do you have a time when you say, look, this conversation is throwing pearls before swine. I don't know why I'm having this anymore. When do you dust your feet off? When do you knock the dust off of the conversation you're having and say, you know what, this is not profitable? If you have a neighbor or you have a coworker or you have someone who works on the same block you do and you see each other all the time and you're having this ongoing debate, argument, conversation about an issue, and it is souring your friendship, it is souring your understanding of one another, maybe, just maybe, it's time for you to talk with them and say, you know what, I like you too much to keep banging our heads on this. I want to have other conversations with you where, these labels that we're constantly throwing at each other don't intrude. Can we do that? Can we shift gears? Because I would rather talk about other things too. There's nothing wrong with saying, at this point, I'm going to have to, knock my feet off of the dust off of this conversation, knock that dust right off my shoes and just walk away. And I don't need to keep going. And by the way, I would certainly, if you're having online conversations, when you start feeling you're being trolled, when you start feeling like somebody's just throwing nonsense and seeing if they can, stick nonsense to the wall, that might be a good time to say, you know what, I'm kind of done with this conversation. And don't just keep drilling down when you can't possibly win. And so think about that. But these are pre-conversation foundational principles, things you've thought before you have conversation about social issues or real life issues. So, principle number 3. Make sure you know how the game of, quote unquote, changing definitions works. Watch for it. It is a, excuse me, it is a common rhetorical technique that people learn in debate class, where they start with one definition, you're talking about something, and suddenly they bring in a quotation or a person into the conversation that literally changes the definition of what you were talking about a second ago. So now you're not talking about horrible racism of, yesteryear, and you're saying, wow, we all hate this. And now they're talking about whether or not you think, people of color should be given a break on housing. And they're trying to make opposition to that a racist issue. And you're like, wait a second. You just changed the definition, and I'm not okay with that. I'm not okay with suddenly changing the definition of the type of racism that we're talking about. And so make sure you know how that game works so that you're watching for it, you're listening for it, and you're pushing back against just random changes of the definition of words and ideas. At least call people on it. At least say, we've just shifted into another subject. This isn't the same subject. And they'll fight you on it. Yes, they'll say, no, this is the exact same subject. And you're like, no. Burning crosses in people's yards is not the same as talking about whether or not we're going to give a tax rebate to people of color if they're first-time home buyers. Those are not the same subjects. They're not the same. I know folks like to treat them as the same in the conversation. It is a great debate technique, but it has nothing to do with having a real conversation. It has to do with winning an argument. And you can do it, but it's not, I can't say it's not honest, but it isn't an actual dialogue. It's just to win the conversation. And so you at least need to call people on the shift in the conversation. Number 4, think about your definition of winning. I know that changing minds is a laudable goal, but we should answer the question, is changing minds a reasonable definition of winning? Perhaps a better definition of winning is not losing my cool, or getting someone to say, that's a good point. In other words, moving the needle without being so angry that you aren't making sense anymore. That maybe that is a more reasonable definition of winning. Now, I realize there are going to be some of us who say, no, I want to win. I want to change the mind of the person I'm talking to. And I've seen that, as I said, that's a laudable goal. But is it always a reasonable goal? That's something for us to think about, because there will be different reasonable goals depending on who you're talking to, how firm their belief system is, that kind of thing. Okay, number 5. People who believe 90 to 95% of the same thing we do, we should be very, very careful about labeling those folks in any way. Yes, critique, yes, dialogue with them, yes, disagree, even at times call out fellow conservatives or fellow Christians. But remember, if they agree with us on 90 to 95% of things, we probably shouldn't shoot our own. We really need to think about that and contemplate that, because it isn't really helpful if we turn ourselves into camps and we can't walk forward together. Number 6, I would urge you, describe ideas and what people believe. From a Christian perspective, when we label others, it means that we have said, like Jesus of the Pharisees, I am done. Because Jesus did label the Pharisees. He called them names. Called them whitewashed tombs, hypocrites. I mean, very clearly, Jesus labeled the Pharisees. And so we need to know what it means when we label someone. We are saying the conversation really is over. Now I need to just declare that you are this thing and hope that you don't like that thing. And honestly, that's what people we disagree with are doing for us. They're saying, the world sees you as this. They see you as racist. They see you as backward. They see you as a Christian nationalist. And they're hoping that when they put those labels on you, you will hate the label so much that you'll rethink your position. Now, I think, this is my personal opinion here, and not that anything else isn't my personal opinion today, but from an argument and discussion perspective, labeling is an intellectually lazy way to try to win a debate and change a mind. Because we no longer have to talk to people when we label them. And so I would urge you to, until you have said, no, this person is not ever going to change unless I put the label and say, this is what you are. Do you know that? Know that that's what you're doing. Understand that that's what you're doing. And weigh that as what you're doing. Just consider. And number 7. People who are labeling us are laying down a gauntlet. They're saying, what will you do now that I've called you this name? I think it would be wonderful if we thought in our hearts and minds, I want to lay down a different gauntlet. And it's this one. What will you do if I invite you to have a real conversation with me? I have a friend who is seeking to do that periodically. And I watch them as they're doing it, and they have described to me how difficult it is. How truly difficult it is to keep things at the level of, I want to have a real conversation about this. That the labeling, getting out the little sticker, getting out the stamp pad, and boom and boom. Oh, now you're labeled this. And how difficult it is, but what a wonderful thing if Christians were to say, I'm going to throw out a different gauntlet. I'm not going to throw out I've labeled you as this. What are you going to do about it? Instead, I'm going to throw down I want to have a real conversation about this. What will you do about that? And I'm really contemplating, envisioning not a national conversation. What I'm talking about today is not necessarily something a politician at the national level is going to be able to do. Or even perhaps a politician at the state level when they're giving a speech. But I am thinking that this is something we need to consider when we're talking to good friends on Facebook. Or talking with someone over coffee at the coffee shop. Or considering jumping into a conversation at work or in our neighborhood or online. And really, that is the context in which I'm talking. The everyday conversations. The conversations you have with real people. Not just nameless, Bob 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But a Bob, you actually know his last name. A Sarah, you actually know her last name. A John, you actually know his last name. Those people. And so if you've thought, oh, he's talking about how I should act on Twitter with all these hundreds of people, or he's thought about what I should do when I give a speech somewhere. No, I'm not. I'm talking about the conversations you have at home, at work, in a coffee shop, with neighbors, and with people you know online. That's what we're talking about today. And hopefully that context, the comments I've made beforehand, will make sense. I really hope so. It's almost time for the third half of our show, which is called Ask Pastor John. But before we get there, let's pause and let's consider this great hymn of the faith. In fact, this is the first hymn in our hymnal. It is called Holy, Holy, holy. Holy, Holy, Holy was written by a man named Reginald Heber. He was born in 1783 into a wealthy, educated family. He was bright. He translated a Latin classic into English by the time he was 7. I don't know about you, but I was not translating anything except the gibberish in my brain into English by the time I was 7. But there you go. He entered Oxford at 17 and won 2 awards for his poetry while he was there. And he became the pastor of his father's church in the village of Hodnet, near Shrewsbury, in the west of England. He remained there for 16 years until he was appointed Bishop of Calcutta in 1823. And then eventually there, in fact 3 years later, the weather and constant travel as a bishop took its toll on his health, and he died of a stroke. He wrote 57 hymns, and most of them are still in use today. Holy, 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 the song, it kind of reminds us of Revelation 4, 6 through 11, and Revelation 5, verse 13, and Revelation 15, 2 through 4, as well as Isaiah 6, 1 through 3, speaking and singing of the great majesty of our triune God. He wrote this text for what is called Trinity Sunday in those who follow the traditional church calendar. And it was to be sung at the same time Revelation 4 is read during in the church calendar. It was published first in the 3rd edition of a book called A Selection of Psalms and Hymns for the Parish Church of Branbury. And then it was published after he died in Heber's Hymns, written and adapted to the weekly church services of the year. That was in 1827. And no one seems to mind that he rhymes with E-E often in the song. It's just a favorite. It has been around all this time and is a beautiful song. The tune is called Nicaea, named, of course, after the Council of Nicaea, at which church leaders began to put together the formal doctrine of the Trinity. And it is a tune composed by John B. Dykes. So as you listen to it, perhaps it brought back memories. In my church, we have a lovely young lady who, every time we had a hymn sing, would request this hymn. And so for a while in our church, we were singing it every other Sunday night for months, if not years. She loved the song. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful song. And it was just one of those things that I'm not exactly sure. She sometimes has trouble communicating. And so I wasn't exactly sure why she loved this song so much, but she did. And she sang it with gusto with the rest of us. And so it is a beautiful song that has stood the test of time and declares that our triune God is truly majestic and glorious. Now, for the third half of today's podcast, we have a bit of off-the-cuff Q&A. This week's question is, Dear Pastor John, how can I be more bold? Well, there are just a couple of principles that are helpful here. And they really are foundational, because if these first two principles, first two truths, aren't fully embraced by you, then being bold will be impossible. And let me flip that over. When we lack boldness, there will be something lacking in one of these first two truths that I'm going to put before you. What are these first two truths? They are, number one, be clear in your mind about what you believe. Think about that. If you are clear in your mind about what you believe, it becomes a simple matter to declare what you believe. Okay? But if you're muddled, and you know you're muddled in what you believe, if you cannot say what you believe about God, about Jesus, about salvation, then it becomes very difficult to be bold, because, there are a few of us who are, proud enough and narcissistic enough that we think everybody wants to listen to us. But most of us, it's not that makes us bold. It's, I know what I believe. And so it is straightforward for me to declare what I believe, because what I believe is right there in my mind, clear and straightforward. But then there's a second thing. Not only know what you believe, but know why you believe what you believe. Know why you believe it's correct. Now, you may not be able to answer everybody's question, or every question a person can think about with regard to the subject you're talking about, or the subject you want to be bold on. But if you know why you believe, then not only can you tell people what you believe, but you can give them the reason you believe it. For example, if I say, I believe that Jesus is God, and someone says, well, why do you believe Jesus is God? I think he was just a good teacher. I will say, the Gospel of John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And I will say, see, it says that Jesus, because he's the one that was made flesh, the Son of God, that it not only was he the Son of God, but he also was God, so I'm going to tell you that Jesus is God. So I know what I believe. Jesus is God. And I know why I believe it, because a specific passage in the Bible tells it to me. Now, that may not be your reason for knowing why Jesus is God, but it is mine. And so that's why I shared it. I don't have to have every answer. I know why I believe it. And that's all you need. Because no one can expect you to know everything. You should have the freedom in your conversations to say, hey, I don't know that answer, but I'm going to look it up. I'm not saying there isn't an answer. I'm saying, I don't know it this second. And so let me look it up for you, and I'll get back to you. So know what you believe, and know why what you believe is correct. The third is not truly significant, except it helps you worry less. See, these first two truths are the most important. This third truth is just to help you worry less. And what is that truth? Know the likely consequences if you are opposed and if you are wrong. What's going to happen if you're talking to someone about what you believe and they don't like it? What's the likely thing that's going to happen? In most of our contexts, they're going to say, oh, okay, you... In most of our cases, what they're going to say is, oh, you believe that? Well, I disagree. And here's why. And unless you're someone who likes to fight, that's the end of the confrontation part of the conversation. You might talk a little bit more, but it's not going to be super confrontational. And that is actually the likely scenario. And you say, well, what happens if it's more than that? Well, you can what if yourself until you are not courageous at all. But if you realize that the most likely thing that's going to happen if you are opposed, is they're going to tell you what they believe and why. That's not that scary. And what if when they tell you that they believe something different, and then they tell you why, what happens if their answer looks better than your answer? What if it makes you look wrong? Well, you know what the likely scenario there is? One, you feel silly for a second. And two, you say the same thing if they asked you a question that you didn't have an answer to. You say, I'm going to have to think about that, and I'll get back to you. And then you can enjoy the study and learning, talking to your pastor, talking to a good Christian friend and saying, hey, this person said this, and it stumped me. It made me wonder if what I believe is right about salvation, church, missions, whatever, angels, demons, baptism, worshiping on Sunday versus Saturday, whatever the subject is. Well, see, neither of those consequences are all that scary. And so, that puts your worry aside, unless you're going to let your imagination run away with you. And that's a different conversation, right? But if I know what I believe, and I know why I believe it is right, then I'm on a firm foundation. And then we come to the fourth truth. So the first two are fundamental. Know what you believe, know why you believe it. Third is just to help you worry less. Know the consequences. If you're opposed, know the consequences if they share something you weren't prepared for and it makes you look wrong. Okay? So now we're in the what do I do? Here we go. Try, risk, repeat. You know how you get bold? You get bold by doing. If you say, but I'm scared, well, everybody is scared. Soldiers are scared until they've tried, risked, soldiers are scared until they have tried, risked, and repeated until it's no longer scary. Police officers, same thing. Firemen, same thing. Paramedics, same thing. In fact, any job where you can fail spectacularly, it's the same thing. You try, you risk, you repeat. You try, you risk, you repeat. You try, you risk, you repeat. If I know what I believe, and I know why I believe it is correct, then the question comes, will I let my imagination and worry keep me from try, risking, and repeating? Or will I try, risk, and repeat? What will I do? And for most of us, what we really need to do is change how we define failure. We worry about failure if things don't go perfectly right, whatever right means. But failure is actually not trying. Failure is not if things aren't perfect. Failure is if I say, okay, this is too hard, I'm just not going to do it. When we don't try, risk, and repeat, we fail. The writers of the New Testament ask this question: How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? What were they asking? They were asking God's people back then, and us today, to respond with a yes when God asks us to do things. And that the problem was not whether we would succeed or fail in the Did we get it perfectly right? The problem was neglecting saying yes. How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? Or the words of the Apostle Paul, work out your salvation in fear and trembling. Notice what Paul said. He said they would have fear and trembling, but he didn't say, okay, when you have fear and trembling, circle your wagons and quit and don't try. He said, no, work out your salvation when you are in fear and trembling. And then I am challenged, and I hope you are too. When the disciples did not have the perfect response they wanted, sharing the good news in the book of Acts, what did they say? We must tell what we have seen and heard. I believe that's Simon Peter who said that. We must tell what we have seen and heard. That's you and me, isn't it? If we know how Jesus has changed us, if we know what He has done in our hearts, then how can we not share what we have seen and heard? And embracing that call is how you and I get bold. That failure is not about getting something just right. Failure is not trying. Failure is throwing in the towel before we have risked. And so try, risk, and repeat. And I guarantee it will make you bold. Now, you might want to continue this conversation. And if you want to, you can connect with us at any of our social media portals. On Facebook, you can find us at calvarybaptist.indianola. On X, you can find us at Calvary for Jesus. And on the web, you can find us at calvaryindianolablog.com. Next time, we're going to talk about Galatians 3:15 through 19. And so I hope you'll join us. It is our hope that during this podcast, you've been given something to think about, something to stretch you, and certainly a greater freedom to think deeply about this life God has given us. May you know the grace of God found in Jesus, and may His love richly bless your life. Take care now, and God bless.